All right. Hi, my name is Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grant Makers for Education. Welcome to this session on out of school time. I'm very excited for the panel we've got today. I know we've got a great number of folks who've registered. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gwynn Hughes of the Mott Foundation.
Thank you, Celine, and welcome everyone. It's great to see, I have to say, it's just been so nice to be able to see so many of you more frequently, and really appreciate you, as always, taking some time today for the lunchtime discussion here on OST. What we were thinking, kind of based on the conversations we've had, that would be good, and your interests and expressed priorities. You know, we are now moving obviously into what is education going to look like over the next 6 to 12 months, with various states taking, different approaches. Some states starting to look at reopening, and lots of conversation in the policy areas around what guidance is needed, pulling together on that. And so what we're focused on today is how does policy and the importance of it in communications over the next several months. How do we think about that? How is the field mobilizing? And how is that helping to lead us in the right direction? So we've put together a couple speakers to highlight the policy work that's currently going on at the national and state levels, and I'm sure many of you might know about more, so looking forward to that conversation. Our first speaker today, and we were just talking, I think Celine mentioned this is our 7th conversation in the series, and Jodi Grant joined us for the first conversation, so she is back here today. It's hard to believe how much we've learned and has changed in that period of time. So we thought it'd be great to have Jodi come back. She is, of course, the Executive Director of the Afterschool Alliance and is leading a lot of the policy and communications work. So Jodi, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you as our first speaker.
Awesome. Thanks, Gwynn. So yeah, I can't believe it's been 2 months since I last spoke to all of you. I feel like it's been years. There's a saying that says like 30 days has September, April, June, and November, all the rest of 31 except March, which had 8,000. And I kind of feel that way. I feel like it's been thousands of days. As we navigate what's going on with federal policy overview, I think our number one challenge remains the challenge that we've always had in our after-school space, which is a focus on academics and not enough recognition for what kids need outside of academics. So, I think one of our real goals is to highlight that with kids being isolated on their own right now, they need much more than academics, and that the enrichment, the social emotional learning is absolutely critical. And that if we expect kids to be isolated for weeks, if not months, we can't just expect them to go back to school. So I think that's a really important message. And I think the after-school community is trying to address that now. I also think, and we're going to get into this, that as we think about summer and reopening, which in many ways is going to be one and the same, because what happens this summer is going to be a model for some of the reopening, there's an incredible opportunity here to really integrate positive youth development and our whole sector into a learning day as opposed to just an academic day. And the great news there is that we're needed, because with social distancing and space requirements, there's no way that this can be done by school alone. So that's my optimistic note. Since I last spoke to all of you, the federal government passed the CARES Act, which was the latest stimulus bill. We were hoping to get a specific earmark for after school. We did not, but I think that's okay. All of the provisions in it allow after school and summer learning as an allowable use of all of the dollars. And I think that given the integrated approach that we're looking at, that is, I'd love to have a separate set aside for after school, but it's fine. So right now, we're spending an enormous amount of time working with the state networks, and you'll hear from Holly later, on implementation of those CARES dollars. So as you think about summer and reopening, how those can be used to incorporate after school and summer learning. And the state networks have been a tremendous partner because they're doing extraordinary things, and all these decisions now need to be made at the state and local level, and we need out of school time to be at those tables as they figure out and envision what it's going to look like. So that includes $3 billion of funds to governors, and they can use that for out of school time amongst all sorts of other things. $13 billion for K-12 funds, again, that allows after school. There's a $300 million discretionary grant for state education agencies for innovative learning opportunities. After school programs can apply for that. There's also childcare dollars, which are primarily going to serve the children of essential workers. I don't have a handle right now on how many after school programs have been able to get the PPP loans, but my sense is some of the intermediaries and larger organizations have been successful. So we're hoping to get a better handle on that. But for the programs that have been able to get PPP loans, that has been life-saving, particularly those that are fee-for-service and had no other income. Another big issue on our mind right now is meals. We have waivers that have been allowing us, and if you've read the articles, a lot of after-school programs are delivering meals to provide meals with school being out. And we're going to need a waiver from the Department of Ag to keep doing that once school is officially closed, even though very few are operating. In our minds, in the advocacy world, we are still thinking very much like, what do we need today, now? What do we need short term? What do we need long term? And with a recognition that this could go on for another year to 18 months. So very much there's going to need to be a long-term plan as well. There's some interesting data. As much as I talk about this concern about a focus solely on academics, I think after school is starting to break through. So I don't know if Kathleen shared 2 recent articles about what after school programs are doing, because we're often getting from policymakers they're closed. So why do they need any funding? And of course they do. But a recent poll, and this was from April, I think this will change over the summer and you'll see even more of a shrink. 69% of parents are concerned about academic loss. 61% are concerned about loss of after school activities. And that doesn't even get into socializing with other kids, emotional needs, mental health needs. And I think, the policymakers seem to be the last ones to grasp this. So that's where our goal is right now. And as I said before, I think we're really working very closely with our partners. I was just on a call with Amber and some national leaders, really working at a national level and at a state level to try to have all sorts of out-of-school time actors at the table. I had a meeting with the National Governors Association yesterday, and we were talking about resources for summer, and they hadn't thought about libraries, parks and recs, all the places where we can operate, especially if the student to staff ratios are going to have to be much smaller and the actual facilities are not going to be allowed to have as many kids. So I also think that in the places that are reopening, our field is much more prepared to open sooner. We'll be much more prepared to open sooner than schools, just because of the nimbleness of our programs and the places where they can operate. And that's going to be really important too, particularly because, as we all know, the one thing that's come out loud and clear is that inequities are exacerbated, right? We have kids that don't have internet. We have kids that don't have, even if they have internet, they may not have the equipment to use the internet. Even if they have the equipment and the internet, they don't live in a space where they can, get quiet time to do it, or they need assistance and they don't have that assistance. We have kids that are worried about their parents losing jobs, about meals on the table. We have kids whose parents are working and they're home alone, but they're not considered essential workers because they're in the fields or in the poultry plant. So really trying to remedy those inequities. And of course, an investment in 21st century goes right to some of the communities that have those most vulnerable kids. We're thinking very much outside the box as we think about reopening. So I mentioned a couple of entities, but really what I would love to do, and I'm not the only one thinking of this, so I can't take full credit, is create kind of a blueprint for what it's going to look like to reopen. And it wouldn't be proscriptive, like do ABC, so much as here are all the resources you should be thinking of tapping into. And it would be, you know, something that we would have community-based organizations sign on to, faith-based organizations, chambers of commerce, libraries, museums, science centers, parks and recs, AmeriCorps volunteers, which are going to be instrumental, you know, public housing, teachers unions, CCSSO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, higher ed, to think about all of the different actors that should be collaborating and can add something. I think, you know, youth workers and, you know, summer youth employment dollars. So have a sense of who are the partners, what are the funding streams that we may be able to tap into, because we know dollars are going to be reduced even further, and we're looking at across the board cuts, and then some of the best practices that are evolving and guidelines that are evolving that we can share to help make this happen. And I think if we get a huge national blueprint for this with organizations on it, then that's going to help at the state and local level and elevate some of the models that are already out there. And as you're going to hear later, like, we have states that are already doing this. And one of the things that I said to the governors yesterday was that I think it's essential that they recommend that every governor that's thinking about reopening have an after-school state network and after-school representatives at that table, because they can help pull in all of these other OST providers. And as I said before, I think this is going to happen when school reopens too, because I don't know when schools are going to reopen, but if you look at guidelines, they're going to have much smaller classes. I think that's a good thing. They're looking at staggered schedules, they're looking at longer schedules, and there's just no way to physically do this. They're going to need more physical locations without support of a whole nother field. And it's an opportunity for us to rethink after school, but it's going to be longer hours for our after school workers who are already, that's the other irony that we're hearing, that after school workers are working longer hours, because when they're doing meal delivery or checking in on kids or virtual learning, they're not doing it from 3 to 6. They're doing it from 9 or 10 in the morning till 5 or 6 at night. And getting to the big piece, of course, to do all of this, we are going to need a pretty good idea of what's safe to do, public safety. And this is relevant policy-wise because we're not going to get any national guidance. If you read the headlines in the paper today, you'll see that the White House rejected a plan from the CDC on reopening. A little more, you know, of the backstory on that. The American Camp Association and the YMCA had hired a team of public health experts to write guidelines for reopening this summer for camps, which will be tremendous for our summer programs because we could follow them too. And the CDC came up with a 37-page document based on their recommendations. They were told to water it down. They came up with a 17-page document that had a variety of things well beyond, you know, summer programming, and the White House quashed it. So it's not coming out from the CDC, but the Camp Association is going to publish it, and it should be up by next week. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has signed on to it, will co-brand it. So I think this will be fabulous for us. It's something we may want to think about for out of school time programs too, like really getting some public health experts in to tell us what's safe, what's not safe. We have a lot of examples from the programs that are serving essential workers kids, but I would say they're all over the map. Many of them cost close to $800 a week per child, which is huge. That's because of the needs for PPE, the needs for cleaning, the needs for smaller staff to student ratios, the need for smaller, more locations or smaller places to house kids. Many of these programs have like a 1-to-5, 1-to-6 ratio of adult to student. The cheapest I've seen is like $250 to $300 per child per week. Those seem to be programs where they actually have a 1-to-10 ratio, which seems high, but it's, again, that is working in those places. And the good news is, and this is again where I'm going to put in another plug for the state networks, I'm running out of time, is that Washington State's coming up with a model for all of this. So a few more things. We're very worried about losing staff So we have done a survey of the field to get a sense of what's going on right now, and are going to be doing another survey at the end of the month to figure out what programs are losing staff. I think in some cases, unemployment benefits are better than staying on staff, which is a testament to the problem that we don't pay our staff enough. And then I'm just going to jump ahead on my notes and just talk about next steps, which is the House has been working on a bill. We thought it was going to come out as early as next week. It's not, because it's too big. So they're trying to, and this is just House Democrats, so they're really trying to pare it down right now. We are really pushing for an increase in 21st century funding one time for summer fall. There's also an ask for a $500 billion Treasury program that would go to nonprofits to deal with COVID needs, which would be tremendous for our field. So it would go to staffing, which we need more staff to work where there's increased need on COVID. There's a $250 billion ask for education overall, which would include after school, which would, be very good for us if it happened. So, we're gonna keep weighing in and see what happens with all of that. But hopefully we can get a massive group together to just talk about any kind of funding that comes out, how we can make sure that positive youth development and out of school time is part of it. So I'm going to leave you with the things that I think you all could be very helpful with. One, I talked about having this blueprint for reopening. If you can bring the leadership of your grantees together to talk about that, to get as many of our entities on board as possible. So I think, one big meeting where we pull everyone together, I think that could be really, really helpful for those of you that are regional or local, doing the same thing at a local level, so that everybody can be on the same page with, being a part of reopening. That would be terrific. I also think it may be worth thinking about investing in a public health firm to get some real information that we can trust on reopening out of school time programs. Support data collection and best practices, and of course support intermediaries, because right now, as you're about to hear, they are playing an incredible role in getting a pulse of what's needed on the ground and what's needed by the field.
Thank you, Jodi. I think that as you're hearing now, Jodi can't do this, and I know several of us support the Afterschool Alliance. This is a time where they really have been working 24/7, along with, I think, many of our grantees. And I know, it's been really interesting to see how, with the trajectory of this, without these intermediaries and the groups that we are all collectively supporting, there really is a lack of information and guidance. And so I hope all of you are experiencing, I think, what we're seeing, which is without these organizations, programs and families are really not getting information or supports that they need. So when we think about what's ahead and the policy that is going to be required, I think our community has a huge role to play, because convening, like Jodi is suggesting, actually getting the resources. I mean, programming is going to be different. It's going to be more expensive. All of these pieces are really going to be, I think, game changers moving forward. So to transition from Jodi, we're going to talk now to Holly, who is an executive director of Vermont Afterschool, so one of the statewide after-school networks. And as many of you may know, this is something the foundation supports, but it's also our funding is matched by local funders and many others. So and this combination between what the federal organizations like Jodi's are doing with that of the states and the state networks, I think is another really interesting and important intersection. So we wanted to have Holly provide us with that perspective of what's happening policy-wise at the state level and how that coordination works. So Holly.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Gwen said, I'm the executive director of Vermont Afterschool. We're a statewide nonprofit. We've been around for over a decade with this blend and mix of public and private funding, including ongoing funding relationships with multiple state agencies in Vermont, as well as state and national and regional private foundations like the Mott Foundation, the Overdeck Family Foundation, the Vermont Community Foundation, the STEM Next Opportunity Fund, and the McClure Foundation. We don't provide any direct service to children and youth. Rather, we serve in that intermediary systems level role to promote cross-sector collaboration, provide professional development to the field, support for evaluation and best practices, technical assistance, and so forth. So we work with programs, community organizations, schools, anybody working with children and youth. Ages 5 to 26 is our range in Vermont, outside the school day and over the summer. And I hope it's apparent to everybody on the call, and building off of what Jodi said, that when states and schools moved to shut down, the out of school time field did not go away. But it's been surprising how much we've had to say that. There's been kind of this assumption. They didn't go away. What we've seen them do is they've shifted and adapted and responded in a myriad of important and creative ways. They are providing direct service in childcare to children of essential workers. They've created systems to help working parents find childcare, in-home childcare, especially for second and third shift workers in the medical fields. They have stepped in and completely changed their roles to become food service providers and delivery services on school buses. They're holding virtual affinity groups for youth to talk with one another about issues that they care about. They're offering virtual homework help. They are hosting online spaces for youth to connect, share music, do activities together, to do trivia competitions. They're sending home enrichment packets, so they know that the equity is an issue, so they're sending home complete packets with art materials and supplies, and then posting on YouTube the activities and meeting and connecting with young people online. And they're also serving for one-to-one coaches for families, reaching out to make sure that families and youth are connected to food, medical, mental health, employment, housing, and other resources they need. And they're planning for summer. And what they're saying right now is, as the weather gets better up here in Vermont, kids are coming out and they're out and about and around, and they are not always supervised and they are not always safe. And they are really concerned about the kids who are choosing to be outside instead of online on computer games, and what that might imply about home environments and what they are seeking. So they're really looking for ways to respond. As a statewide network, we are really fortunate to have so many strong connections and relationships that have helped us at this time. Our response has been multifaceted and fluid. We are in constant contact with the field. We have open calls almost every day of the week. And we meet as a team once or twice a week to set priorities for this moment in time and base our decisions on how to respond, like I'm saying, on a weekly or biweekly basis. Here's what some of that response has looked like. We've moved all of our training and workshops to a virtual space. We're offering over 25 free online but live real-time workshops and sessions for the field just in April, May, and June. We've been working to foster that coordination and communication that Jodi and Gwynn spoke about across agencies. One glimpse of how that looks in Vermont with these reopening guidelines. It is the Agency of Education that's coming up with guidelines for schools to reopen. It is the Child Development Division that is coming up with guidelines for licensed childcare and school-age programs to reopen. It is the Agency of Commerce and Community Development that is coming up with the guidelines for summer camps, both day camps and overnights to reopen. And then it's the Department of Health who has all the health and safety guidelines. So much of our time and day is like, it's not whack-a-mole, but it's like, oh my gosh, there's another conversation happening over here because the out-of-school time field doesn't fit into one agency or department the way that some other programs and niches help. So much of this connection and coordination, because for our families and for our staff, having one set of guidelines on what it looks like to operate safely and well is going to be really important. And our governor actually, I think, is still in the press conference to roll out those guidelines in Vermont today, right now, as we're speaking. Another thing that we have found super important to do is to create spaces for people to connect online. This cross-sharing across communities to try to alleviate some of that inequity of one program doing this over here and another school doing something different. How do we help those communications? Just last week, we hosted a virtual youth forum in Vermont with Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman. We had 27 young people ages 9 to 23. And I want to pause for a moment because there's two big messages. We can share the recording and you can listen. Their stories are amazing. They talk about isolation, loneliness, being separated from friends, but also family members. There was even one story of two twins that are separated because of different medical needs. There is one young man who spoke eloquently, and this is one message I think we need to hear. He asked that decision makers spend as much time worrying about their mental health and their emotional connectedness as we are about their academic learning, as much time. And over that message came through. A second big message was that young adult age group. All of a sudden they find themselves as adults and now they're unemployed, can't pay rent, or having really hard conversations with roommates about health and safety. They are finding that transition to adulthood to be particularly difficult during this time and are asking for extra supports and attention in that time period. As a network later this month, we're going to start offering regional parent forums in different communities across the state to talk with parents about, in particular, mental health concerns with young people and building connections with other parents. I want to say in this work, we've been really fortunate in working with the Mott Foundation to learn from and alongside our colleagues across all the other states. In Idaho, they've been approached by the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare to create a social emotional learning institute for after school and summer programs, which would be supported with funds through the CARES Act. In Wisconsin, they've developed a robust system of supports around trauma-informed care, which includes professional development and resources. That network is now working with others in our across the U.S. to share those resources across state. The Connecticut network developed guidance for school-age care services during COVID-19 pandemic. That resources we are all copying and using. With food security, we are all involved with assisting with food access sites and distribution. New Mexico network compiled a list of known meal sites taking place in school districts throughout the state as a resource for programs and families. And I offer those examples with that this time has been marked by intense work within our own states, but also an incredibly high level of sharing, collaboration, and exchange across the states. So how we can utilize and continue to grow that is a perfect example. Things that you can do, or we hope you're thinking about, is funding for stabilization of the field. It is much more expensive to operate under these health and safety guidelines. Programs mean more time for planning. When you think about planning, they're actually planning for two types of programs at the same time. They're trying to plan for in-person programs and at the same time figure out how to continue virtual programming if they can't open or if they have to open and then reclose. Mental health supports for staff working in these programs, as well as for the children and youth they serve, is huge. And then connection and unification. Any ways to reduce competition and really support this collaboration, like I mentioned across this, like we're seeing with the statewide after school networks, would be of great help right now. I am gonna wrap up and save time for questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Holly. You know, one thing that has been really fascinating to see is, not that I think this is ideal, but because of the conditions we're in and what is not coming from a national sort of administration point of view, is the states have been able to kind of inform each other as they have gone through the pandemic and the different phases of it. What Holly didn't quite have time to get into, but we can talk a little bit more later. An example of how this policy coordination can work is if the Alliance has, for instance, a governor's letter template. Holly's outfit can then, actually mobilize the field in Vermont to get that into the governor's office. And more of this is going to be critical because a lot of the funding that is designated from the federal government is discretionary. So helping to inform those models from the statewide point of view is going to really matter a lot in terms of what resources are going where. So what we wanted to have for our final speaker here before we open it up to questions is Belah Shah Spooner, who is from the National League of Cities. And we've been fortunate to have Belah's outfit as a key TA partner for a lot of our initiatives after school for many years. So she's very familiar with the system and with the field and also with what's going on in cities. So Bela, take it away.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Nice to talk to all of you. Appreciate being part of the conversation. So yes, I work for the National League of Cities, and I'm in our Institute for Youth Education and Families, which is actually the largest department of NLC. I like to always remind people of that. People don't realize. So the National League of Cities, we are a membership association representing cities, all size cities, tiny, medium, and large. And primarily mayors and city council members, city managers are our members. As Gwen said, we've been supported by the Mott Foundation for almost 2 decades, and so grateful to really be able to lift up after school as a strategy for cities. And so we've developed mayoral and city champions over the years that are really investing deeply in after school, from using city dollars or supporting nonprofit organizations. So this has been really a tough time, as you can imagine. NLC, just to give you a little bit of background on some of what cities are facing, and I'll get to the after school piece, but cities we've done a survey with the U.S. Conference of Mayors to look at what the budget shortfalls have been for cities as a result of the COVID impact. And so we're seeing 98 to 100% of cities of all sizes that are seeing revenue declines. And so it's very significant. And a lot of the impacts are in the public services sector that are going to be impacted. We have some great infographics on our website that really look at that. So for cities that are small, under 50,000, 50% of them are anticipating having to cut public services. 70% of cities in the 200 to 500,000 range. 63% from the 50 to 200. So it's very significant, and some of them are going to include police and fire impacts as well. One of the main things right now we're seeing as this is starting to roll up and have impacts is cities are starting to have to lay off and furlough a lot of staff. NLC has a really unique local action policy tracker on our website that we were able to develop with support and partnership from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And just looking at it yesterday, this week, cities have been inputting the number of city employees that they're having to furlough. So, you have examples of Phoenix, 1,000 employees laid off, Louisville, 218, Rochester, close to 400, Cleveland, 650. I mean, it's significant. And they're trying to reserve those resources for police and fire, EMS, and other essential workers, which means that a lot of these layoffs and furloughs and sort of job sharing are happening in parks and recreation, libraries, other types of services that definitely impact youth and families. So that's a huge concern for us. I'll just say, so as a result, NLC has just launched a campaign this week, actually, called Cities Are Essential, which is really pushing for $500 billion for cities and counties over the next 2 years. So this is a big fight that we're in because cities are very concerned about potential bankruptcies. And there's just a real negative dialogue going on about, city mismanagement and all these things, but we know how many services cities provide to people as well. So just in response to how cities are looking at after school and summer, there's been a lot of work going on with some of our large cities in particular that we've been tracking. We have 2 networks that we convene on a regular basis. Large cities, their mayor's education policy directors, as well as an after school network of all size cities that we meet with as well. So what we're seeing primarily is that they've really shifted some of their work. They're doing a lot of technology distribution really concerned about the online access and the digital divide that many neighborhoods are facing, many children are facing in neighborhoods. They've been moving to do meal distribution. They've become meal sites at libraries and recreation centers. And really trying to expand partnerships with broadband services to ensure that people have access to Wi-Fi. So there's been a lot of work in that space and a lot of need there still. Cities have been fundraising to really meet some of those basic needs. Again, the food piece is really a concern, but many have been very successful working with their school districts to ensure that the after school and summer meals are going to continue. And for online programming, many cities are actually continuing their online programming. I was happy to hear that 21st Century Programs in Bridgeport that's receives over $1 million from the city budget. None of those funds have been cut. They're offering them online. In Grand Rapids, they're offering them online as well. I think the next question is always, well, how many kids are actually participating? And those numbers have been a little bit low, and so they're reaching out to their students. In Denver, I saw some great examples there of work that their Denver Afterschool Alliance, an intermediary, is helping to support their providers with a lot of professional development and toolkits. They produced a very impactful map looking at the areas of greatest need in their city and where there are programs that are running and where there are programs that have the capacity to run but don't have facilities because they typically operate in the schools. So it's very interesting to see sort of that there is capacity and interest to serve, but there are some really big barriers there in making sure that young people are served. So there's thousands of kids that they've been able to document across Denver that are not served right now with programming because they don't have a place to open them and they're not going virtual. In terms of summer programming, there's a lot of questions still on the table. There are some cities I've heard from Nashville, Fort Worth, Grand Rapids, and Bridgeport, as I mentioned, that are talking about opening for summer. They got a leaked copy of that CDC document that Jodi referred to, and so they were working with those guidelines, really excited for the new ones coming out. Heard from a city in Orlando that is not going public yet, but they're thinking of opening as they had planned, June 1st, and doing a 1-to-10 ratio. They're just concerned because they also see kids hanging out, and they really want to make sure that they're hanging out, safely with the appropriate space and all of that. I know I'm coming up to my time. I'll just mention that summer youth employment has been another really big focus of ours. We've shifted gears. We've never really done deep work on summer youth employment, but that has been a big role that cities have been playing. And so we did a survey, and of our cities, 70% of them said they plan to continue to operate those programs and ensure that young people that had signed up for the program will receive payment. We know a lot of young people rely on that paycheck during the summer to support themselves and their families. And so many cities are still committing to do that, going online, partnering with their schools. In Memphis, they have about 1,700 kids, and the mayor was very adamant that this program would not be cut this summer. And so it's interesting, they're partnering with their school teachers to offer online training, programming, a lot more of the sort of soft workforce skills. And the college is going to be supporting the teachers with some of that PD, and the city will be paying the young people. So that's one example. Los Angeles is really committed to doing that as well. We know, they're in New York, they talked about canceling the program, but there are many cities that are still committed to doing that. So we're really heartened by that. But some of the needs that still remain are, again, just to reinforce, is around technology access, support for professional development. Some of the cities that have intermediaries that sort of serve as a hub for networks of providers really feel like those intermediaries need some support. And then as cities and states are reopening and thinking about our after-school providers, youth development folks, are they in those task forces? Are they on those groups? Some of the cities that I spoke to said that there have been some youth voice organizations involved on those groups, like in Rochester, New York. In Denver, she said she's trying to get herself in and make sure that the after school and summer needs are embedded into that thinking, that it's been challenging to do so. So I think any leverage for funders on the phone that have connections to folks managing or participating in those task forces, really lifting up that after school and summer providers and youth voice to be incorporated into those task forces would be really helpful. I'll pause there. How's that?
Thank you, Bella. That's great. So thank you to all of our speakers here, and we thought we wanted to leave, as we always do, a few minutes for questions for any of our speakers. So does anyone want to dive in? I'm looking around here. I'll start off with a question, maybe for Jodi. You know, one thing we've talked about in this group is around communications strategies, and if you want to talk a little bit more about some of the communication strategies and how we can help with that, I think that would be great. So we talk a lot about policy, but I think communications is a key kind of accompaniment to the policy actions.
So yeah, thank you. I'm glad you asked that, because you know, one of the things I didn't mention before was we've done 2 surveys of the field so far, and we're going to be doing some more with actually hiring a firm to do it properly now. And what we found is that somewhere between 16 to 18% of after-school programs are still open, and primarily serving the children of essential workers. Of those that are closed, 92% are still doing things with kids. So you're hearing that they're doing virtual learning, they're doing check-ins, they're doing meal deliveries, they're doing lesson plan deliveries, especially where kids might not have internet, they're doing one-on-one tutoring. And I think we really need help with communicating out that this is happening, because we're hearing all of these stories about what teachers and educators are doing, which is great, but we're not hearing about, or we're starting to, but we're not hearing enough about what an essential role, what a lifeline these after-school programs are. And I think that for policies going forward to include out of school time, they need to recognize that in this pandemic, we're playing a big role. I think the other huge role that programs are playing is connecting to parents. And you're even seeing more parent education going on because parents are home. So I think highlighting that could be super helpful. And then I think helping us communicate and getting all of your grantees to communicate what, you know, we're all hearing loud and clear, which is the social emotional needs of our kids have to be addressed as we think about going back into whatever reopening summer looks like, and that there's a field out there that is ripe and ready to help, and that they need to be at the table. So, so we will continue working with, you know, many of the partners, and the more the merrier, on communications tools. We've put out quite a few. We have some videos people can use. As Gwynn mentioned, we're putting out talking points for governors. We're working on a similar piece of talking points and letters for local leaders on the importance of funding out of school time in education packages with the education dollars, to really use this as an opportunity to highlight that these programs are critical to our kids' development. Mm-hmm. And I also think, you know, helping us get as many voices of your grantees as possible, because this needs to be, as we work with all of the different actors, it needs to be your school day educators, it needs to be the business community, it needs to be out of school time providers, it needs to be science and tech centers and libraries, because we're going to probably need their spaces to do this right, and they're not going to be able to reopen for business as usual anyway, to really think completely outside the box on how, where, and when we educate our kids with this OST component.
Mm-hmm. Holly, go ahead.
I wanted to layer on top of that just an understanding of how complicated it is right now for grantees to navigate. It's incredibly complicated for them to get an answer of what it's going to look like, or even if the state reopens, it's often up to an individual school district, at least here, to decide whether or not their building's going to be able to be used. So supporting kind of those conversations and a real understanding of the complexity and like I said, at the same, well, as Jodi showed, like at the same time, they're still trying to reach out to families and youth when they don't even know what operations look like from day to day. So that complexity is very real and as also a major stress for the for staff. So once again, the social emotional learning supports for the children and youth, but we're also seeing the mental health support needs for staff and in the field as well.
I just want to jump back in because another side of the communication is sharing resources and communications that way, because sadly, we are not going to get national guidance. Every time I talk to the Department of Ed, they're saying, well, no, we want the states and locals to decide. The states and locals are worried that if they decide something, then the Fed's going to come back and say you shouldn't have done that and take the money away. And so all of this communication, sharing best practices at the state level, at the local level, whether it's the National League of Cities, whether it's the state after school networks, whether it's grantees, sharing, the guidelines that have been put out can help organizations on the ground not reinvent the wheel and help us do things better and protect us from any kind of federal oversight, since we're not going to get that guidance.
I had a question maybe for the group itself. And Hannah, you can see if someone raises their hand, right? Because we do have a lot of people on. Okay, so I'd love for people to respond to this and just raise your hand if you'd like to speak. But what strategies are people, funders, developing and using to help your grantees and the youth development sector and the out-of-school sector have a place at these tables? So these tables right now are operating. People are planning for how to reopen school. What do you see in your communities? Do you see that the youth development sector is included? And if not, what are the ways that you can use your influence, or you already are, as a local regional funder to ensure that those voices are at those tables? I'd love to have a sharing of this. Sharing strategies.
Yeah,
if anybody wants
that's a great question. Anyone working on that? It's also can be hard to, I mean, what we've really been depending on our grantees for is to find out about these too, because trying to figure out where those conversations are happening is also a bit of a challenge. So you need to know where they are before you can help influence them, right? As Holly said, they're kind of all over the place. Rebecca, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So I've been putting a few comments in, but I can elaborate a little bit. In California, where we have a massive expanded learning system of over 4,500 publicly funded programs that are generally in school sites, we are getting some traction, around the need for after school to be part of that recovery effort with schools. And I think our school leaders are listening. There's nothing official yet, but one of the things we're going to help the Department of Education do is share some of their data around attendance. So they're sitting on this great minefield of student level attendance that shows students who have gone to their after school programs are attending X number of days more of school. And that, of course, also translates into dollars for the districts. So in this time where districts are talking about, all these students who are just completely disconnected and that they may never come back to school because they're so disconnected, and it's almost like this throwing up your hands, what can we do? If after school is part of that solution, it can help entice the students to come back because they very well may be in touch with those organizations now, or may want to come back just for the opportunity to have access to those programs. So that's some of the messaging that we're trying to push here in California and elevate as much as possible. But, you know, I put a comment just wondering how, you know, even though Jodi, you mentioned all those programs are closed, they're not really closed. So I think, you know, even saying they're closed is damaging narrative to share. So if they're in touch with students, how do we, you know, how do we capture, like, who are they in touch with, how many students, and help the districts add that into their own numbers to be part of the team of the positive story?
Rebecca, I think that's such a great point. And there's also a proactive way to use stuff. So we've seen some districts that are trying to keep track of which students they're hearing from, which, you know, who are tapping into the classes, and then identifying the kids who aren't, and then using the after school program to reach out to those families and kids in a proactive way. So not even just collecting the numbers, but really using that talented workforce that knows kids and families so well to help pull them back in a really proactive way.
I think one thing that would be interesting is, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, Jodi, but just getting into the guidances, right? So the school districts are going to be reacting to guidances that they get from the organizations that they have to listen to and the organizations that they want to listen to, right? So there's their state departments of education. There's the, you know, Council of Chief State School Officers that you mentioned. There's the National Association of School Superintendents and the National Association of Secondary School Principals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they must all at this moment be developing guidances. And those guidances, it would be really awesome if all of those guidances said you have to reach out and integrate your youth development and after school sector into your planning. Like, how do we make that happen?
That's what we want to do, right? Yeah. So I think, you know, I think that sharing some of the models that's happening, that, you know, are happening at the state and the local level are a really great way to do it, and sharing guidance. And I think it's, you know, youth development's a piece of it too. I think one other piece that I just wanted to flag for everyone, because I found this really eye-opening, is that, you know, the programs that are serving the children of essential workers, the demand is nowhere near as high as you would think it was. Many of the essential workers would far prefer to leave their child at home where it's safer with, you know, a neighbor or a relative. So we're seeing much lower demand in places like DC and New York. Programs have actually closed. And I know from some of the great state network meetings that in states that are completely opening, programs aren't opening because they don't want to be liable for people getting sick. So I think, you know, like, we need to have youth development at the table, but I think another place where youth development and schools need to be on the same page too is creating some kind of guidance, no matter what governors say, to make parents and workers feel safe. And that's where I think our field is going to be able to navigate that faster than schools, because we also don't have to deal with, you know, collective bargaining and unions and all of that to start serving kids, but we want to make sure it's safe. So I know I went off a little bit, but I think that's public health and safety has to be kind of the first thing we think about in everything we're doing. And it ties to why we need to be at the table, because there's no way we can do this with the way school looked or education looked before things closed down. It's going to have to be much smaller cohorts, smaller number of kids in rooms, teachers that are probably assigned to classes full day and not moving around. And we can really, you know, we're going to be needed to do that properly.
I think we can also, Jodi, help this summer on a smaller scale, like almost a soft opening of schools. One of my concerns is that schools will decide, no, we just can't handle it. We don't want to do anything this summer. We want to wait till fall and just focus on reopening. But I think that that's a missed opportunity, one, to serve children and youth, but also what we've learned from the programs offering the essential care is that they learn as they go and they figure out these systems. And I'm concerned that if schools just wait, you know, to the fall, they'll miss this opportunity to work with the youth development experts with this more flexibility, with smaller group sizes, and start to do some of those lessons learned, and then really be ready to go full force. So I'm hoping we can get that message across to schools right now as they're making those decisions.
That's right. You know, I also think, and each of you talked about this a little bit, but I don't think we can underestimate the power of convening and communications. Lifting up these stories, I don't think has ever been more important. And I think for all of us here with your various networks of influence, simply getting these stories out there and convening and using that power of convening can really make a huge difference, especially right now. Well, thank you, everybody. And let's give a collective thank you of thumbs up for Jodi and Holly and Bella. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, this was so much information. I learned so much from you all. Thank you.